For those of you who don't know me, I'm Elliot Posner. I teach in the political science department. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the department. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to convey our deep gratitude to Ms. Eloise Briskin. It's her generosity that's made it possible to have this series of talks called the Global Currents Discussion. Today's talk will be the third and last in a series that has stimulated serious conversations about some of the most pressing international issues today. So now let me turn to today's talk. We could not have planned a more timely visit for Lauren MacLean, who, among other things, is one of the country's foremost specialists on the politics of Cote d'Ivoire. Lauren is an assistant professor of political science at Indiana University. In the short decade since she earned her PhD from Berkeley, she's accomplished a lot. She spent 2 years at the University of Michigan as a Robert Wood Johnson Fellow. She's established herself as an expert on the politics of sub-Saharan Africa and American Indian and Alaskan Native communities, and has helped to stimulate much-needed debate in political science about our increasing reliance on a narrow set of methodologies. Lauren is the author of Informal Institutions and Citizenship in Rural Africa, Risk and Reciprocity in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, published by Cambridge University Press in 2010. Her articles have appeared in some of the most prestigious scholarly journals, including Comparative Political Studies, Comparative Studies in Society and History, the International Journal of Public Administration, and the Journal of Modern African Studies. She's currently co-authoring with Ben Reed and Diana Kapaszewski. This is her second book to be published by Cambridge as well. This one's entitled Field Research in Political Science. And in addition, she's co-editing a volume with Melanie Kamet entitled The Politics of Non-State Social Welfare Provision in the Global South. Now, I have known Lauren since our graduate days at Berkeley, so I was particularly eager to read her book to see what she's been up to over the last decade. And I can tell you this is a terrific book. It was a great read, and I highly recommend it. For social scientists, it's a model for designing and carrying out a careful comparative research. For political economists, it's an example of how to connect on-the-ground phenomena that affects real people so it connects this on-the-ground phenomena with national governments, the international economy, and Bretton Woods institutions for undergraduate students and general readers. And I know this firsthand because I assigned it in my course this semester. The book is an accessible and as well as sophisticated voyage into a part of the world with which we're integrally connected, yet about which we tend to know very little in this country. Finally, because of the tragic turn of events in Cote d'Ivoire, the research behind the book offers insight for understanding the horrific events that have unfolded on television over the last several months. It gives me great pleasure to introduce and welcome Professor Lauren MacLean.
Thank you, Elliot, for that very generous introduction. I really am glad to be here. This is my first time in Cleveland, first time at CASE. So it's been great to catch up with old friends, but also to meet some new ones and new colleagues. The title of my talk today is Democratic Peace and War in Africa, a comparison of risk, reciprocity, and citizenship in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. So my hope is to really focus our attention on some important political developments in West Africa. For the past several months, most of the media has really focused on what they call the Arab Spring in the Middle East and North Africa. More recently, we've been consumed with the military intervention, or skirmish, in Libya, and I'm quoting Sarah Palin there, and the tsunami in Japan. Only in maybe the past week has the media begun to cover the events in Cote d'Ivoire more seriously. But here, the media's lens has really focused on the rivalry between two presidential candidates, particularly the tensions since November 2010, when the internationally agreed upon loser, former President Gbagbo, wouldn't leave the presidential palace. So what I'd like to do today in this talk is to put these contemporary news events not only into a longer historical perspective, but also a comparative perspective. So I'd like to compare what we see as the war in the headlines of Cote d'Ivoire with the relative democratic peace in Ghana. So why would we even compare these two neighboring countries that seem so disparate today, Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire? There's a long history of comparison of these two neighbors. And in fact, in the early 1990s, there was a lot of optimism among Africanists, among policymakers and politicians all around the world about the winds of democracy that were sweeping across the continent. These two countries were no exception. So in the early 1990s, both Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana appeared to be opening up their authoritarian regimes to multi-party competition for the first time in decades. Cote d'Ivoire was moving from the single-party state that President Houphouët Boigny had dominated since independence in 1960. The grand-père, the father of Ivoirian politics, was finally allowing opposition parties to compete in the election. In Ghana, J.J. Rawlings was taking off these military fatigues, donning civilian clothes to contest the first multi-party election after decades of coups and turnovers of regime in Ghana. In both cases, the first elections, the incumbents were able to maintain their hold on power despite competition from other parties. So Rawlings was elected as president in 1992, despite opposition claims of voter fraud and intimidation. Houphouët Boigny was elected in 1993 with disputes from the opposition over the numbers, but not over his victory. So while both Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana began similarly along this path of political liberalization in the early 1990s, since then their paths have diverged in striking ways. So my talk today explores what explains these differences and how democracy is unfolded. While the process of democratization has not been perfect, and there have definitely been bumps in the road, and some violence, it's been very, very limited. And I will show here evidence of a greater, what I call democratic peace and consolidation in Ghana than in Cote d'Ivoire. So here we see competing billboards of the two top candidates in the 2008 elections. So from the two strongest political parties, the NDC on the left and the MPP on the right. The election results for the first round were so close that these two candidates were forced to compete a month later in a runoff election. Ghanaians, I received a flood of emails kind of expressing fear and concern and nervousness. They were nervous about the runoff election, especially after witnessing the violence in Kenya. So they didn't want to be another Kenya. They were worried that the election results would be disputed, that there would be violence during the polling, and then particularly after. But Ghanaians all seemed to breathe a tremendous sigh of relief when the runoff was really pretty peaceful. So in this photo, you see men and women of diverse ages patiently waiting in line to vote in the elections. This is the runoff election in late December. The victory of the NDC, at that time the opposition party, was razor thin. The results were so close, but they were accepted all around, and the then incumbent stepped down. Power was transferred peacefully to the new government. Importantly, this was the second alternation of power between political parties in Ghana since multi-party elections began. So people really have begun to talk about Ghana as a more consolidated type of political system at this point with these alternations of power. So it's not just me who noticed. It wasn't just the Ghanaians who showed their appreciation for democratic peace. They were thrilled when President Obama also signaled that Ghana was a model of democracy for Africa. Despite his Kenyan heritage, he chose Ghana as the first country in Africa for a presidential state visit in July 2009. Some Kenyans received this as a snub. Others acknowledged why and what the rationale was for the visit and for the choice. Obama himself, in his address to the Ghanaian parliament, said, "By traveling to Ghana, we hope to highlight the effective governance they have in place." Now we turn to Cote d'Ivoire. The democratic peace in Ghana contrasts sharply with what we have seen there since 1999. So this photo of youth clashing in the streets of the capital city of Abidjan may look like something you've seen recently in the news, but it was actually taken in 1999. I want to illustrate here that the events that we've been witnessing recently have a much longer history. So after being recognized widely as one of the most stable countries on the continent, Cote d'Ivoire was destabilized in late 1999, immediately after my own departure from field work, with a military coup. So the coup was then followed by instability and basically ethno-regional civil war. So this map on the right highlights how the national political system had basically broken down and how the country was essentially divided into a mostly Christian South governed by one set of political elites and a mostly Muslim North governed by more than one group of leaders. Elections were again and again promised by Gbagbo and postponed over the past decade. But finally, in November 2010, there was the promise of possibly reunifying the country under one elected leader. Where the losing candidate accepted the results graciously in Ghana, the incumbent, Gbagbo, pictured on the left, from the FPI party, refused to acknowledge the loss. So in what was a very public and rapid consensus around the election results, the international community all expressed agreement the opponent, Ouattara, on the right, was the winner. But the struggle was what to do when he wouldn't leave, how to enforce the results. So we've all seen recently what some of the outcome has been for this protracted struggle. The past 6 months have been a stalemate between these two opposing candidates. It's made good fodder for late-night TV about them, facing off from their respective hotel rooms. But the way this is experienced on the ground is that there have been a number of battles in various regions of the country, and then fought finally in the capital city in Abidjan. Very upsetting for scholars like myself, where Cote d'Ivoire was always the host for refugees from its war-torn neighbors in the region. Now, hundreds of thousands of refugees have been forced to flee their homes for Liberia, Guinea, Ghana, Togo, and elsewhere. You can imagine further the strain that these Ivorian refugees are putting on those recently reconstructing and impoverished countries. So even with the recent military assistance of the UN, the French, the arrest of Gbagbo, violence appears to be continuing in the capital. The question remains whether this internationally recognized president will be able to consolidate his support domestically, and whether he's able to control this myriad of paramilitary and military soldiers. What does seem clear is that democratic peace is still a long way off in Cote d'Ivoire. So the question that I'd like to turn to in this talk is, why has Ghana turned over power to the opposition in peaceful democratic elections while Cote d'Ivoire has been racked by this long ethno-regional civil war. What I will argue and emphasize is that we need to look beyond national electoral politics to understand how Africans think and participate politically at the local level. So where other scholars are investigating the formal electoral institutions or how various political parties are organized officially in the capital cities, I emphasize the importance of informal institutions. I argue that you need to look beyond what is written on paper to understand politics in Africa. So this is a photo that I took during my dissertation fieldwork in one of the Ghanaian villages in the late 1990s. And I think you'll agree with me that it probably would never appear on the front page of any major outlet. It doesn't look like news, right? The photo shows young men, a group of mostly tomato farmers who were back from farm early, and they're sitting on, these are utility poles, and they're just sitting around talking. And what I would argue is this may not look political, but that these are important moments for understanding how politics work in these cases. So these men had been called, the reason why they're sitting there is they had been called by the village chief to come help contribute free communal labor to help erect these utility poles so that they could be connected to the central kind of electric grid. What I see is that how and why these youth engage with the state, why they agree to participate, why they comply with that request, and how they initiated their claims in the first place to get the extension of the electric grid is really important to understanding politics in this country. Meanwhile, the village right down the road, unfortunately named Ohia, Poverty, is left out of the electric grid. Why? They voted for the wrong political party. So there's really important kind of stories to be told at the very local level. These local everyday politics are more important than the sporadic turnout and the decision to vote or who to vote for every 4 years. So it's only by understanding this that we can understand the big differences in macro politics that I was discussing before. So to give a sneak preview of what I'll say in the talk, my argument is that variations between Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire are fundamentally due to differences in the history of state formation over time. So the colonial state and the post-colonial state was constructed very differently on either side of the border. And then how that state role was experienced by people on an everyday basis affected how people organized informally. So I show how the informal institutions of reciprocity have diverged. And then finally, I'll argue that these informal social networks affect the way people think about citizenship and how they organize and how they engage to make political claims. So the way I investigate this question is to use what's essentially a quasi-experimental research design. So I basically compare cross-nationally. Okay, this is where I want to wander. Is this working? Yeah? Okay. Okay.
Let me turn it on, if it's not on. Is it on? There you go.
Here, hold on. Okay. So I basically compare cross-nationally two regions that prior to colonial rule, there was basically a shared Akan ethnic group that migrated from the central part of what was then the Gold Coast, or the Ashanti area, and they migrated this way. And then in the late 1800s, basically at the Berlin Conference, the Europeans get together and they arbitrarily make the borders of Africa. And so this is the border that you see between the two countries. And so I'm looking at two similar villages in this region of Ghana and two similar villages in this region of Cote d'Ivoire. So basically, the villages and the regions were not just similar in terms of their shared ethnic culture, their pre-colonial ethnic culture, but I also chose villages that were similar in terms of the distance to roads, the levels of infrastructure, the distance from the coast, the levels of education, the incorporation into the global economy. So these are both kind of cocoa growing areas, relatively wealthy compared to the rest of the country. And these are many of the important variables that we might imagine would affect some of the outcomes that I'm able to control with this design. Now, this is a photo of one of my research assistants conducting an interview with a woman on the outskirts of one of the villages in Cote d'Ivoire. And I show you this photo to highlight the face-to-face nature of the data collection. So I spent in total about 18 months in the field in 1996 and then in 1998, 1999. The timing of this data collection is important because it all occurred prior to the beginning of the breakdown of this ethno-regional conflict in Cote d'Ivoire. So it's a particularly opportune moment to understand how things are organized. It was not planned, but it worked out well. In this study, I combined quantitative and qualitative methods. So I did a survey in the two villages with about 400 people, focus groups, in-depth interviews, oral histories, observations, and also policy and archival research, which I'll draw from a little bit of each of these things during the talk. So the beginning stage of my argument is the key differences we see in these two regions were due to the very history of how the state was actually constructed and formed over time. So I need to acknowledge that this is actually a controversial argument. So what I'm saying directly challenges much of the theoretical literature and scholarship, especially in African politics, which theorizes the weakness of the colonial and post-colonial state in Africa. So some scholars have argued that really the differences between British indirect and French direct rule have been overstated and oversimplified, and really this is kind of a stupid argument. Others have argued that even it doesn't matter whether it was French or British because no colonial states were very effective. They were so weak that it never had any impact at all, especially in the rural hinterlands. So my research is pointing to a quite different conclusion, and I'm showing the way that the state role was constructed and imagined over time in three areas of political administration, social service delivery, and economic policy were experienced very differently in these two regions of Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. So I show how the state mediated risk in these three areas through a more decentralized state in Ghana, in the Ghanaian region, versus a more etatiste and activist state in Cote d'Ivoire, led to more diversified informal institutions in Ghana versus more kind of concentrated types of institutions in Cote d'Ivoire. So basically, the state is affecting these very informal social reciprocity, the way people help each other, the extended family system, the ways village neighbors help each other. Again, controversial because most people would argue that those are really insulated and protected and do not change and should not vary in these two places. So my book covers all of these areas, but we don't have enough time for that. So I am going to try to save time for discussion and only highlight one, the state, the different roles of the state in political administration. So I'm going to try to show how a more decentralized state administration was viewed in the Ghanaian region to be supplementing what existed on the ground. and led to a more diversified set of informal social institutions. Meanwhile, this more centralized administration, both by the French and the post-colonial state, set out to govern individual citizens within a nuclear family, and that stimulated a more concentrated set of reciprocity networks. So, starting with the British, I'd like to give you just a flavor of how differently the British and the French envisioned their role in mediating risk. And for each of these things, I'm going to give you some evidence from the British or French perspective, but also some evidence about how that was experienced on the ground through oral histories. So according to the British colonial records, the British objective in administration was not to replace, but to adapt as far as possible the indigenous African institutions. So they didn't see themselves as transforming the local institutions, but building on them, supplementing whatever might be missing or needed, but not fundamentally replacing what existed at the local level. The British notably spent a lot of time trying to understand these local institutions. In my oral histories with elders, as they recalled their own experiences, as well as what they had kind of heard from their parents and grandparents and uncles and aunts, they described the chiefs, so the local institutions that the British were working with, as the leaders and the spokesmen for the people. The chiefs were the local government, so they really emphasized how important that they had still been. This really highlights how the colonial government was extended, but working with what existed on the ground. Meanwhile, the goals on the French side were quite different. So we can see the differences even in who speaks about the administrative goals and where those records are located today. So as a researcher, I did most of my archival research on Ghana in the capital city of Ghana or in regional capitals in Ghana. So very decentralized housing of records. In contrast, for my archival research in Cote d'Ivoire, I did it in Paris. Now, there were advantages. It was air-conditioned, and I had computer access. But you can see kind of the very different ways of kind of organizing the state, even in terms of where these records are today. In this quote, we can see the centralization of governance because it's the Governor General for all of West Africa who is speaking. And he says, the Commandant de Cercle alone gives orders. Only he is responsible. The native chief is only an auxiliary instrument. So this notion of auxiliary is repeated in many of the colonial records. But what about the village experience? My oral histories with elders, they also spoke in very different terms about the role of chiefs during the colonial era. So they described the chief as the representative of the state here. Very different viewpoint on whether or not they were being represented upward. They often also remarked about how the chief was charged with conscripting forced labor, and they were very resentful about the chief's role working for the French. So this is one point in time. In the book, I kind of trace this process of political administration through independence, but I'll give you a second snapshot here. The second snapshot is of how the post-colonial state also approaches administration quite differently. And this is despite a shared global pressure to decentralize. So you have huge pressure and financial incentives to kind of adopt these decentralization programs. In the 1990s, the Ghanaian post-colonial government was actively involved in one of these decentralization programs. But it looked very different in Ghana than it did in Cote d'Ivoire. So in Ghana, decentralization was a more genuine devolution of decision-making, all the way down to the district and to the village level. In 1988, 110 new district-level assemblies were created. In 1998, unit committees were created at an even smaller political level. So in the villages where I was living, the unit committees were really important and had recently been elected. They would meet twice a month, and they would deliberate, and they often shared authority with the village chiefs, to the extent, even in one of the villages, the unit committee actually held the traditional gong, which was kind of a sacred instrument used to share the news from the chief. And it was a unit committee member who held the gong and then would work in collaboration with the chief to see what news needed to be shared. In contrast, the Ivorian government was also ostensibly committed to decentralization. They talked about it, but it looked very different on the ground. So in Cote d'Ivoire, it was essentially deconcentration. So they were moving the central bureaucracy out to the people. There was very little room for any kind of local participation, any kind of local decision making. So when I interviewed ministry officials in Abidjan, I said, well, what's happening with decentralization? And they said, oh, madame, we are working very hard on this, but you must understand this takes time to bring the state down to the villages. So there was a very explicit kind of recognition of how this authority was being deconcentrated. In the region where I conducted field research, new sous-prefectures had been created, but those were still over an hour away and very expensive to travel for village residents. So this was a very distant kind of connection with the state. There was no elected body at the village level. So there was no institution at the village level to make decisions or to deliberate. The village residents, when I talked to them, also kind of expressed this very detached and kind of top-down view of decentralization when they said, our village now belongs to the commune of the regional capital. So again, there's an ownership that comes from the top down. So now into the second box, to the next stage in my argument. Thus far, I've tried to establish that colonial and post-colonial states were constructed very differently and that was experienced differently on the ground. Now I want to try to make the link that this state role affected how people organized informally. And so these informal institutions also diverged in surprising ways. So this is a photo of an extended family in the first village where I conducted research. And the patriarch is sitting in the middle, and he was actually a rival to the chief. When he heard of my arrival in the village and my living situation at the chief's palace, he then invited me over to lunch every Sunday to debrief me and kind of give me the other side of whatever story I'd been hearing. Many development economists, anthropologists, historians, political scientists have theorized that informal institutions of reciprocity, the ways that people kind of help each other in times of hardship, in extended families such as these or among village neighbors, are really important, especially in Africa and particularly in rural Africa. So when I started to do this research, I found that there were many assumptions about the strength and the resiliency of these informal institutions, particularly in the era of neoliberal state retrenchment. People imagined that as the state withdrew, these institutions would kind of automatically surge and become really powerful. But there was not a lot of data about who was actually included, who might be excluded, and how these things were actually operating. Most of the myths about these informal institutions would have predicted that there should be no variation between the villages I studied based on kind of their shared pre-colonial cultures, similar kinds of land tenure institutions, matrilineal institutions, and all of this. So part of my data collection was to try to document this reciprocity. I asked about 17 different kinds of help that might be given and received. I tried to ask about it over a 12-month period to avoid seasonality biases. If I asked in the hungry period in one place and the harvest time in another, or Christmas time in another, it would really skew the data. I also asked about how much to or from who, so specific social ties, so auntie, cousin, specific social ties. And then I asked if it was a gift or a loan. And this actually came from the pilot of the survey, realizing I assumed that all of this was gifts, an exchange of gifts, and many of the exchanges that were being made were actually conceptualized and understood to be loans. So, what did I find? When I analyzed the data, and this is data for help given, and I can tell you later why I analyzed help given rather than help received. But this was help given for medicine, hospital visits, school fees, school supplies, and clothing. I found really surprising differences. Again, the fact that there was any variation at all was surprising to many and kind of challenges the conventional wisdom. But in general, I found that the Ghanaian networks on the left had a much lower kind of value or quantity of reciprocity exchanged, but that the help was given and it was much more diversified across social ties. It tended to be more horizontal, linking youth rather than crossing generations. So the Ivorian networks tended to be higher in value, but still importantly not very high overall. So that's an important point for both. But they were more concentrated on a few number of social ties and much more vertical, linking the youth to their elders. This is some additional quantitative evidence that illustrates how much more diversified the Ghanaian networks were than the Ivorian ones. So you see here that the nuclear family is the most dominant for both regions and villages, but the dominance of the nuclear family is much more exclusive on the Ivorian side than it is on the Ghanaian side. What's important to note on the Ghanaian side is also the importance of friends relative to the Ivorian side and to the other social ties. So that was some of the survey data, but the qualitative data also kind of reinforced these findings. So in these quotes, we see the importance of friends in Ghana. As one respondent said, "It's all to do with friendship. I go to my friend when I'm in need." In contrast, village residents typically describe friends as subordinate to family in Cote d'Ivoire. So as another respondent in Cote d'Ivoire described, "You're born with your family. It's like your hair. It's something natural. You can't get rid of it. Friends, they're like a beard. You can shave it." So there's a very different view that I was hearing repeatedly in the focus groups and in the in-depth interviews. So in my book, I try to show how these different histories of state policies that we talked about before have stimulated this variation. So for example, in agricultural policy, the less active mediation of risk in agricultural policy toward cocoa production has stimulated the shift toward tomatoes. So you saw those Ghanaian tomato farmers at the very beginning. This is a very short-term, quick to get in, quick to get out kind of crop. It doesn't require a lot of land, so it's not a big capital investment, but it does require extensive amounts of back-breaking early morning labor. So reciprocity in Ghana becomes much more important among young, youthful, energetic friends, and less important between the youth and their elders. In contrast, in Cote d'Ivoire, where the state has mediated risk vis-a-vis cocoa production and has kind of facilitated cocoa so it's not a risky strategy, young farmers continue to grow cocoa. So they're shifting out in Ghana, they're continuing to grow it in Cote d'Ivoire. Cocoa requires a lot less labor, but but significant plots of land, which makes social reciprocity not with friends as important, but with your elders within your extended and nuclear family. So in the book, I describe how this has some really important implications for intergenerational solidarity and how people are helping each other across generations. So as a political scientist, I want to get to the last part, which is the most exciting part, which is about citizenship. And I argue that these changes in informal social institutions are not just about how people get by. It's not just a political, economic kind of an outcome. They actually extend beyond the local economy, and they affect how people think about politics. So it affects the way people think about their political community and who they imagine to be in their political community. So what I found is that even in these very similar regions, people think about and practice politics very differently. This is a photo of an opposition party organizer. So at the time in 1998, this was the party that had never yet been able to get a victory. Rawlings had continued to kind of beat them out. And they were celebrating the opening of a party office right in this teeny little village. And you can see she's dressed in regalia from head to toe. She's very proudly posing for this photo. And they had been meeting weekly, organizing all of the people and trying to get people to kind of vote for this party. What's fascinating is that I don't have a photo like this for Cote d'Ivoire. So it's not because there wasn't an election. There was an election on the horizon. It was about the same time from the time that I was there, but there was no local level mobilization. So village residents would come and they would talk to me and they would say, well, we're waiting to hear what we should do from the big men in Abidjan and, when they're going to come down, and when they come, we'll receive them. But again, it was a very passive, top-down kind of politics that they were describing. So what I want to show in this next section is how these diversified informal networks in Ghana have led to a more community-oriented notion of reciprocal rights and duties. Very different kind of citizenship than the more concentrated networks, which have a more narrow, kind of individually oriented idea of entitlement in Cote d'Ivoire. So first I asked some questions, very open-ended questions, about what rights do villagers expect from the state? The word that was used for state, importantly, was very generic, so it could have been the Ivorian state, it could have been the chief, it was just kind of a very broad word. The Ivorians tended to respond to the question very readily with a whole long list of individually consumed entitlements. So as you can see here, individual loans topped the list, with cash grants a second. And one Ivorian kind of typifies the responses, well, what, buy me a car, purchase me a refrigerator, build a house for me. So more than one thing, very individually consumed types of goods. In comparison, the Ghanaians tended to articulate social services, employment, which you could think of as individually oriented, but it's not kind of a consumable good. It's still, there's something productive about it. But what they would typically talk about were these public goods, like we need electricity and good roads. So a very different sense of what their rights were. The comparisons become even more striking when I started to ask about duties. So first, the Ivorians didn't understand the question. So they would look, puzzled, explain, wait, still struggling to understand what is it I mean by duties to the state. So one woman here says, well, the state should give a donation of money to me. I don't know what I owe to the state. So there's a very kind of difficulty in even understanding. After long pauses, mostly individual kinds of duties. So duties are conceptualized in very individualist terms. The hugest, most dominant response is, well, I guess what I do on my individual farm is my duty. Now, Ghanaians also would mention farm work, but even the way they described it was different. So they talk about it in terms of not their export crop individual earnings, but their food crop contribution to food security for the nation. It was a very different way of talking about it. In general, their responses tended to be much more kind of community-oriented and emphasizing kind of reciprocity rather than a one-way exchange with the state. So finally, I compare here the orientation of claim making in the two regions. And I find that in the Ivoirian region, residents tended to talk about politics and their participation at the national level. So generally, when they talked about who would they go to resolve a problem, they named individuals by name who were elites in the central state based in the national capital. So one woman said, the state helps the villagers through the intermediary of a member of government, the Minister of Economy and Finance, Nyongoran Miamian. He has since been indicted and is in exile. In contrast, Ghanaians tended to talk about the village. So if you had a problem, you resolved it in the village, or at most district-level politics. When we had a focus group discussion and we talked about the broken borehole in the village residents talked about how this could be resolved with the unit committee or with the chief. What I highlight here are the ways that local problems are not being resolved at the local level here, but get channeled up to the national elites. So local politics become kind of things that cleave the national political community in Cote d'Ivoire and not in Ghana. So to conclude, even in these very remote rural villages, what I'm highlighting is that the construction of the state was experienced very differently over time and that it mattered. This divergent history then transformed these very informal social institutions, and then those very different social institutions had political consequences. So these were not just coping mechanisms, as they're often described, but they had political consequences in the ways that politics operated on the ground. So my conclusion is if we want to understand the puzzle of democratic peace in Ghana and war in Cote d'Ivoire, we have to look beyond these formal rules and the national elites and examine the everyday politics at the local level. So this kind of comparative historical analysis helps us understand from the ground up the boundaries of political exclusion and the roots of civil conflict and frustration in Cote d'Ivoire versus the basis for democratic peace in Ghana. Thank you.
Do you want to field your own questions?
Sure, that's fine.
You have a microphone. I'm happy to go first. Yeah. Thanks so much for that great talk, Lauren. So I was hoping you would now take one step further and go back to what we're seeing in the papers and on television, and maybe tell us more about how this conclusion links directly to what we're seeing.
Yeah. So what I would argue is that kind of the and what I would argue is that at the very local level in Ghana, it's not that people aren't aware of ethnic or religious differences. So there are the very similar kinds of patterns where you have a Muslim northern minority on both sides of these regions. So they both have kind of similar ethnic demographies in these different villages. People are aware of these differences, but because of the way that the state has been experienced and the ways that people are kind of organizing themselves, when they are helping their friends, they are often helping friends who may be outside of their extended family, often outside of their ethnic group, and sometimes outside of their religious group as well. So there is more cross-ethnic cooperation at the local level within the informal institutions in Ghana. The combination of that and the fact that you have these local level decision-making bodies that people can go to. So when there are conflicts, one, it's possible that they already know someone who is not in their ethnic or extended family that they have close social ties with. Two, if there is some kind of a problem, there's a local institution to resolve the conflict. So it's not that difference isn't noted or that conflicts don't happen, but they get resolved at the local level in Ghana. They don't channel up to the national level. In Cote d'Ivoire, in contrast, what you have is a history where exclusion is harder, and you have the difference between the rich and the poor is overlapping with ethnicity and religion, and you don't have cooperation across these different groups at the local level. So those differences they're noted, and they create more kind of conflict. There's no place for that conflict to get resolved because there are no local institutions for people to come together and deliberate. Or I should say, the ones that are there are so weak that people don't use them. So any conflicts that happen get kicked up to the regional or the national level. So what I see is that these conflicts then kind of get channeled and they become magnified in the Ivorian context, and they actually kind of blow out and get projected on the national political scene where that wouldn't happen in the Ghanaian context. So there's basically no place for that conflict to get resolved on the Ivorian side.
Thank you. I, too, thought it was a terrific talk. And I want to say that it kind of confirms my own experiences in the South African context, why South Africa was so lucky not to have exploded after majority rule. In every town and village, there were literally dozens of organizations that were like a fabric of a training ground for democracy. And with, singing clubs and soccer clubs and youth groups and trade unions and you name it, women's groups, they were just all out there. And they were regularly meeting. They learned what it took to work out problems. And a lot of countries in Africa didn't have this experience. And the result was when they were, voting is not democracy. It's only a small step in the way to democracy. And I think your research really adds to that kind of argument that you have to experience democracy firsthand in order to be able to handle it on a larger scale.
No, so, this is, I have read some literature from South Africa that does seem to resonate with what I'm finding in Ghana. And it's not just the chieftaincy institutions, because there's some good work that's talking about how these chieftaincy institutions continue to persist in the multi-party system and play a role that actually may be positive for democracy and not kind of antithetical to democracy. So some really interesting work on that in South Africa. But also just kind of the what people learn as they're participating in these different groups, I think, is really important. I've done some other research, though, that kind of suggests that you really need to look within these different associational groups to try to understand how are they structured and what are people learning from those associations. So on the Ivorian side, there are producer cooperatives that look from the outside. Like if you read Ashutosh Varshney's work on India, you might think, oh, this is great. This is how we're going to be able to reduce conflict, are these producer cooperatives that involve everybody. But they are so hierarchically structured and so exclusionary that what you learn is how to be left out of decision making and how to be kind of exploited. So I think, again, I guess I'm pushing scholars to try to unpack and look deeply and look locally to try to understand how these things play out.
Thank you first. How do you think that this fits with literature stressing, I guess, like civil society in general? And do you think that these differences are already ingrained, or that like promoting civil society organizations and trying to, I guess, support those institutions at the local level would solve some of these issues that we're seeing?
So I'm starting to kind of engage with more of that literature now, as I'm looking even more comparatively at the role of non-state actors in the provision of social welfare. And there's kind of perspectives on both sides about the roles of different kinds of civil society organizations at the local level. Again, I guess some of the literature on civil society, I think, is overly optimistic and paints a very rosy picture about what the consequences are going to be for service delivery, for democracy, for, everything, prosperity, for everything. And I would say that, again, it really kind of depends. It depends on kind of how that civil society organization is structured and who's participating. And one of the things that we're looking at in terms of social welfare provision is also the notion of sustainability. So a lot of NGOs in both of these contexts do not have long shelf lives. So they're kind of rotating in and out. And I find that also in my work in American Indian health, that it's very difficult to have effective service delivery, but also kind of positive political learning when the turnover is so high. And that, they're very precarious because of their dependence on international funding. So I think there's a lot of interesting areas for more research in that area.
I wanted to go back to the elections in Ghana to ask, so is politics in Ghana also ethnicized, or is ethnicity politicized there, and it's just that for some reason groups are willing to accept outcomes of elections and not resort to violence? Were there political entrepreneurs who tried to use ethnicity in Ghana and it just didn't stick? Or how where does it how does that work out?
So there has been a fair amount of scholarship that's trying to look at voting patterns, to look at whether people are kind of voting on ethnic bases in Ghana. particularly because it's this more promising case of democratic consolidation. You know, maybe we actually have programmatic parties in Ghana. And I wouldn't go that far. So, you know, there are kind of associations between certain political parties and certain ethnic groups, you know, from their kind of founding members and their original social bases. What I think is different is that it is not part of the rhetoric that's used by political elites. So it's even if it's there and it's partially operating, it is not being mobilized or played upon or used at the national level in the same way where it is just very blatant, obvious, and ugly in Cote d'Ivoire. So it's very much in the back seat, I think. And a lot of the research that's been coming out is kind of inconclusive that it's very complicated how people are voting, that it's not kind of along ethnic lines per se, or that might not be the causal mechanism. So it might be correlated with ethnicity, but that might not actually be what's driving their vote. So.
So related to Elliot's point, but also going back to your explanation of the presence of local mechanisms of conflict resolution in Cote d'Ivoire, in Ghana, and the absence in Cote d'Ivoire, could you explain how that played out in Cote d'Ivoire in the recent elections? Is because my understanding, just from reading a few news articles about it, is it was really a conflict over the election results, and it was initiated and strengthened by the contenders themselves, not that it was some conflict that bubbled up from below and then was leveraged or used by political entrepreneurs such as the contenders at the national level. So I didn't quite see how the local and the national, the absence of the local conflict resolution or decision-making bodies at the local level might have played out in this national conflict, if they did at all.
Yeah.
Not that your theory needs to explain everything.
Yeah. No, I guess what I would say is that it is true that there is this kind of national level contest over the election results themselves. What I would argue, though, is that this conflict really has a much longer history, and it's really, so the original kinds of tensions between these political elites do reflect deeper levels of kind of exclusion. And so the fact that you have, this ragtag combination of paramilitary, child soldier, youth army, militias, to me really reflects that this is not kind of a top-down, organized military support for Ouattara. It's real, and I think that's the most disturbing piece, that I'm not convinced that he knows, and people have really worried that he's kind of opened up this Pandora's box by allowing them to fight in his name when they really may not be his supporters. So what I argue is that they're fighting against Gbagbo, but I don't know that they're for him. So, I think there is kind of a longer level of local political and economic exclusion in Cote d'Ivoire that just was not ever acknowledged, and just the opportunities for prosperity were so kind of shut down and systematically shut for certain groups. So then I do think it kind of gets mobilized in this rhetoric. So.
Thank you for the talk. And as a historian, I appreciate the term political entrepreneurs. I guess pretty awesome. I have, I guess, two questions. One is, I wonder about the political roles of women at the local level, and if there is a gender bias of any kind. And my second question would be about the chiefs, how they perceive their roles towards the higher ups and the lower downs.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of so the political roles, you mean at the local level in terms of how women are participating? So I actually, I would say that, that I show this picture of this party organizer that's a woman. And there are a lot of and in the local village level elected bodies, there are actually quotas, and this is interesting. So the village level elected bodies had a few seats that were appointed by the ruling political party at the district level, on the justification that women might not get naturally voted into office. So this was a way of ensuring that there were some women included on the unit committee. I think it was really a justification for maintaining some control over this elected body. So it wasn't 100% elected. There were these few little seats that were reserved and appointed. They were sometimes appointing women because that was the explicit justification, but there were also women who were being elected to those bodies. Ghana has this reputation for having very powerful, especially powerfully economically, women who, and powerful kind of politically. So they were participating. I actually haven't looked at the data on citizenship, and I looked at the data on the informal social networks, but not the ones on citizenship to see if there was a gender difference, and that would be really interesting. So I should look at that. They were very active also in local churches, which I argue is one way that people are learning to practice democracy, is in these church groups that are meeting. And those were often single ed, so that the women had women's groups that they were very active in. On the Ivorian side, not so much, but not so, it was just, I'm not sure that there was a gender bias. It's just no one was really organizing as much on the Ivorian side. But that's a really important question. In terms of the chiefs, the chiefs definitely perceived their roles very differently. And in, they kind of were very conscious of exercising their authority. So when, whether it was getting approval for the research or when there were conflicts that came up as I was conducting the research, the chiefs were very active and wanting to be sure that things were resolved in the village. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm actually from Ghana. I'm learning a lot of things from your presentation. When you compare Ghana with Brown Harbour region, the village that you did your research, and you compare these two villages in Ghana and Ivory Coast, when the chiefs. The power of the chiefs, when you compare these two countries, do you see a difference? Do you see the indirect, the direct rule and indirect rule influence? I don't know. Do you see our chiefs in Ivory Coast as authoritative as Ghana, or they are not?
No, in the Ghanaian villages, the chiefs were really one of the first kind of political authorities who governed whatever happened in the village. So, when I was trying to make sure that it was okay that I did this research project, they were really the first people who were kind of brokering that and approving that. And they were the first ones to say to the rest of the village in a very public meeting that this is what's happening. And I've decided this, and this is what's happening. In the Ivorian side, when I was coming to do my research, or when things happened during the time that I stayed there, it was usually, and actually where I was accommodated was also telling. It was kind of one of the local wealthiest plantation owners who was really the decision maker,
Right.
who was on site. What was important, though, was that many decisions were delayed because they had to seek the advice and the counsel of this even more wealthy and politically powerful bureaucrat who was in Abidjan. And he was a bureaucrat and a businessman. And so I actually kept hearing about this man, Bonzu. Everybody's like, well, we'll ask Bonzu. And I kept hearing about him, but I'd never seen him. And then I was summoned to Bonzu's house. And I was really nervous about meeting this man, that I'd heard and who was so powerful. And I don't think I ever went to his house in the national capital, but it was in the regional capital. And I was brought in, and there were just tons of people, like supplicants, waiting to meet with Bonzu, who I was quickly rushed past and brought into kind of an interior parlor. And we had this really long discussion, and he, very generous and fed me, and it was becoming quite late, so then he offered to drive me back to the village. But then as we rolled into town, he turned off the headlights of his truck, and he put the engine down real low, and he literally turned it off, and we kind of rolled to where we were going, and he very discreetly bid me farewell, and I kind of hopped in and went into my house, and he disappeared because he didn't want, there was so much pressure on him as the big man that he had kind of was having a hard time negotiating his obligations and didn't want to be seen. So he would come in the dark of night. So that was, so he was kind of the most powerful person as opposed to the chief. One of the chiefs died when I was there on the Ivorian side. The Asantehene also died, which is just horrible. And I was telling someone else that it was scary for my research assistants because they were not local. They were worried that they would be buried with the chief, so they all left in preparation for the funeral. But again, these moments when there is a transfer of power or kind of an opening in the political system, I think is another kind of reason for this more ethnographic kind of immersion in a place to understand politics. Because when someone dies, you can really get a sense of what their authority was and who's stepping in and what the debates are. And so it was very helpful. I mean, I wouldn't advocate, I wouldn't plan it, but...
I've read a few articles that have said the chiefs are democratic than some of the leaders, that more democratic than some of the leaders that we have had, because the chiefs have their council of elders, and they have, the Queen Mother, and the Queen Mother. In the Akan culture, the Queen Mother has a say in who becomes the chief.
Yeah.
And they can distill the chief. That means they can remove the chief from office for any behavior that they deem not that a chief cannot. Anything that a chief does that they feel is unacceptable. but in the African political leaders, they cannot take them out of power. So, looking at both countries, Ghana has had, coup d'etats in the past, but looking at the two countries, you see whether, I was thinking whether the breakdown in traditional authority has had some influence on the conflict that is going on in the Ivory Coast, But I'm also thinking back to Nigeria and to Sierra Leone, Cote d'Ivoire, Liberia, have similar, they might also have stronger chiefs, but they've also got involved in civil wars and all that. So it gets very complicated.
It does. And I think, there's some other kind of causal factors that are really important to think about when you think about Sierra Leone and Liberia that may not be at play in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. So I think this is really important when you're thinking about trying to understand politics, being very careful about the cases that you're comparing and what is kind of varying and trying to be very careful about the kinds of claims that you're making. One thing that I appreciated is that when you started your question, you said, when you're talking about Ghana, and then you said, well, when you're talking about Brangahafo region and the villages where you studied, and I was very careful in my book to try not to make, and sometimes I end up talking in short form about Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, but I would not claim that what I found was typical. So if I went to the northern region of Ghana, I don't think it would look the same at all. But I think it might look different because of the same variables. So I think I'm trying to point out what to look at and how to study the politics in those different places. But I wouldn't say that I'm on to kind of a global Ghana versus Cote d'Ivoire. So I think that, the Ghanaian colonial state and post-colonial state was in fact experienced in different regions very differently. Kathy Boone has been really important for me on that, to really look at kind of subnational state formation. So I think some of the promising political science work is really kind of looking at some of these subnational differences and very careful kinds of case selections, as opposed to the really big cross-national work where there's so much that's different. It's hard to know where to start. So.
Well, if there's no more questions, let me thank Lauren MacLean for a really stimulating talk and a great question-answer session. Thanks so much for coming.
Thank you for having me.